There's a wonderful scene in the old Woody Allen movie Annie Hall in which the camera switches between Woody Allen with his psychiatrist and his lover Diane Keaton, who's in hers. And they're each asked by the psychiatrist how often they have sex. "Oh, hardly ever," says Woody Allen. "I mean, maybe 3 times a week." "All the time," says Diana Keaton. 3 times a week. Some friends of mine were talking about this one day and I had this inspiration. I thought, it's so rare we actually hear people talk about how they negotiate this issue in a marriage or in a relationship. I mean, whenever people talk about sexual frequency, whenever there's an article, we leap on it to find out whether we're normal, whether we have sex as often as everybody else does. But we don't really know how couples deal with this in a relationship. And I had this inspiration. I thought, well, maybe I can get couples to keep diaries about how they negotiate their sex supply. So I have these long-suffering friends who offered to do this for me, to keep diaries about how they negotiate the sex supply in their relationships. And the minute I saw those diaries, I realised this was magic. I mean, just so fascinating, seeing a his and her version of what's actually going on here. I went out on television and radio and recruited people, and I ended up with 98 couples, people of all ages, pregnant mums, young women, older men, you name it. And they did these diaries for me for up to a year. It was the most amazing period of my life because people would keep these diaries and send them to me in the middle of the night, and I'd leap out of bed every morning to see what happened last night. It was the most fascinating time of my life because they got to know a lot of these couples, a lot of these people so well, and they sent me photos of their dogs and their children and their penises, you name it. And I learnt so much about this whole process of negotiating this sex supply. And the issue that really came through most strongly was this gap between men and women, where most relationships, it was the man who wanted sex more than the woman. Men and women poured their hearts out, particularly the men. I mean, the book I produced from this research was called the Sex Diaries. And what people talked to me most about when they read this book was being surprised to hear what it was like for the men, talking about being in a relationship where they were grovelling for sex, where they were spending their lives trying to please the women in order to have some sex in their relationships. And it was so rare to hear men speak so openly about that whole experience of being sexually rejected. Well, as I expected, the big issue which emerged from all of this was this gap between men and women. We know that men are less likely than women to go off sex in a relationship. And in most of my couples, the men wanted a lot more sex than their women did, their partners did. We know what's happening. I mean, all of us know about what's happening out there. Just think about the jokes that are out there. My favourite involves, there are these 3 men out on a golf course early one morning, 3 married men. And one of them says, "Oh, you've no idea what I had to do to get let out today. I had to promise to paint the whole house." And another of the men says, "Well, that's nothing. I had to promise to remodel the kitchen." The third man says nothing, and they turned to him and said, "What did you do? How did you get here today?" And he said, "Oh, that was easy. I set my alarm for 5 o'clock, and when the alarm went off, I nudged my wife and said, 'Golf course or intercourse?' 'Don't forget your sweater,' she said." I think in Australia we'd say, "Don't forget your jumper." There's also an American comedian called Steve Martin who says, "You know that look women get when they want sex? Me neither." So the jokes are well and truly out there. We all know this is a problem. The tap gets turned off. Women often go off sex when they get into long-term relationships. And men may joke about it, and they tell funny stories about it, but in actual fact, they rarely talk honestly to each other about how miserable this is actually for them. That's why I'm talking about this issue today in one of my first vlogs. To me, this issue of mismatched desire is such a tragic problem for men and a really important illustration of this enormous shift in power in relationships that's occurred over, I think, the last 40 years. I mean, now women have gained the power to walk out of relationships where they're not happy. And that means they hold all the cards. And if they don't want sex, it just doesn't happen. And that's a really dud deal for men. The desire gap is very real. I mean, we had a big survey in Australia, we call it the Sex in Australia survey, of over 20,000 people, and that found 55% of women experience low desire. That's a majority. There's all sorts of research from all over the world. A professor in Finland has been keeping these sex surveys. His name is Osmo Kontula, and he's been surveying people for, I think, since 1971, and he's finding a growing gap between men and women in sexual desire, with women much less likely to want sex than the men. We've got research from all over the world showing that a growing number of people are now celibate in their marriages, and there's been a decline in sexual frequency in countries like Britain, the US, Germany, Japan. You'll sometimes find sex therapists claiming that they're seeing all these guys with low desire coming into their offices for help, and that's not what the big surveys show. And I think what's happening here is that when a man has low desire and the woman's unhappy about it, she drags him in for therapy. And that's much more likely to happen than when it's the other way around. So overall, the picture is grim and getting worse. And what's even more worrying is that the finding that women generally with low desire aren't particularly bothered about it. Now, that doesn't apply to everybody. I had this lovely young mother of twins who said to me that she'd apparently perfected the art of saying, "Get that thing away from me," in her sleep. And she was really unhappy about that. She didn't want to reject her husband. She was very conscious of how unhappy it was making him. And she didn't want to be in a situation of constantly rejecting him. So I certainly have talked to many women who are desperately keen to regain their lost libido, women who don't want to reject their partners. But there are also quite a lot of women who are quite dismissive of the problem and see it just as the men's problem. "Oh, for goodness sake, haven't you got over that yet?" they tell them. One of the big differences is often women will talk to other women about this whole issue. And so, for instance, they exchange notes about how to get out of unwanted sex. There are lots of stories about books. You know, you're reading a book and he comes in and you immediately put down the book and pretend to be asleep. My favourite book story was the woman who, she announced to her book club that she said to her husband, "You can have 50 thrusts, but don't jiggle my book." I mean, it's pretty funny, but not nearly as funny if you're on the receiving end. Publicly, men may joke about this, but privately they certainly aren't laughing. And what came through for me was this howl of misery from men. I had one young man writing for me, he was only in his early 40s, but he was in absolute despair at his situation. He said, "I'm totally at a loss as to what to do. I do love her and I think she loves me, but I cannot live like a monk. I deliberately try not to mention sex at all, but I'm so frustrated I don't know what to do. I cannot and will not continue like this. I refuse to go through life begging." Now, before you all write to me and say that with the light change, we ran out of batteries, okay? I'll keep going. I was once actually talking to a group of lawyers about this whole issue. They were couples, lawyers and their partners, and a woman came up to me afterwards and she said she was sitting with her husband, and to her absolute amazement, while I was talking, his eyes filled with tears. And she'd never seen that man cry. He picked up his glass of water and gulped it all down. We're talking here about an issue that really gets to men, and yet we so rarely hear them discuss it publicly. One man said to me, "It's like we're fighting our own Gulf War. The 3 inches between us in the bed feels like 1,000 miles." There are many, many men who aren't even allowed to look at their partners, let alone touch them. I had one man writing for me who'd been married for 24 years, and the last 19 years he's had no sex in his marriage. When their second child was born, his wife said, "That's it, we're not doing that anymore." The amazing thing about this guy is he sent me these love letters he'd written to her, amazing letters about how he just yearned to hold her, to touch her, how he'd love to look at her. I mean, they were just glowing letters about how much he loved that woman. Eventually he left that marriage, and she was just amazed because they actually had a good marriage in many other ways. But she said she couldn't believe he left for the sake of sex. And he said to me, "I just couldn't bear the idea of going through my whole life never holding a woman in my arms again." When my book came out, I had a chat section on my website, and people would write in and have conversations with each other about all these issues. And there was one letter which was entitled, "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" And that was written by a young dad who was in a marriage where not only had there been no sex, there'd been no intimacy whatsoever for many years. No touching, no cuddling, no nothing. And he was in despair. And he wrote this incredible letter about the cost of leaving and whether it'd be worth the fact that he'd probably lose his family and lose everything he'd worked for so hard for, as opposed to facing a lifetime without sex. And we probably had 100 responses back and forth from men debating whether it's worth giving up everything for the sake of sex. It was incredibly sad. Just in case you're despairing about hearing about all these sex-starved marriages, I did have some couples where they had a lot of sex in their relationship. They both had very high libidos. And my favourite was this man who sent me a little note. He said, "I've been keeping my own diary for 24 years. Are you interested?" Was I interested? They actually weren't even diaries. They were those year-in-a-page calendars where you could see all the little, the whole year laid out in front of you, and it was covered in little green squares and green triangles and red dots and so on. And he sent me the key, and the green square meant they'd both reached orgasm, and the green triangle meant she had and he hadn't. And I just had to meet that couple. I went and spent a whole day with them. And they were fascinating. They'd worked so hard to keep sex alive in their marriage. They'd been married for 30-something years, and they were now in their 60s. And every night, the children had grown up, so they had their evenings to themselves, and every night they had what they called their UP, which was the underwear parade. And she took me and showed me, every evening she'd have a shower, and then she had this drawer full of gorgeous things, little bits of sexy underwear, bustiers and G-strings, little bits of lace, not much else. And she'd put on one of these outfits and stockings and stilettos and spend the evening dressed like that, making the dinner, whatever it was. He sent me a little note saying, "I really like it when she hangs out the washing or shifts the hose." I just love that idea of her out in the backyard in her G-string pulling the sprinkler from one side of the garden to another. And of course I said to her, "Every night you do this?" I mean, we always think she's doing it for him because, that's the assumption I think most women make. But in actual fact, she said, no, I'm doing it for me. I like to think of myself as a sexy woman. If I put on my old tracksuit, I feel like such a slob. And I enjoy being a sensuous, sexy woman. So I did have women like that. I had women who wanted much more sex than their partners. I call them my juicy tomatoes. I'll tell you a bit more about them, and maybe I'll have to do a whole vlog one day on that particular issue. So there was a whole range of people in all sorts of different circumstances, but most of the couples, it was very much the woman who'd lost interest in sex and the man who was struggling to deal with it. So what's going on here? I did a lot of research around this, trying to find out what accounts for this gap in desire between men and women. And if you look at this, you find all the research shows is that women's libido is like damp wood. It's really hard for it to light. It needs perfect conditions for it to happen. Fragile, distractible. Those are the sort of things that people mention when they talk about female libido. And it means that one woman said to me, sex gets wrapped up in all the garbage of the day. We're so easily distracted. We lie there thinking about whether the ceiling needs painting or whether we've got cornflakes for breakfast tomorrow, and we bring everything into bed with us. And it means we're constantly distracted. If you can get us away from all of that, get us on a holiday to Bali where we're all relaxed and we don't have all those distractions, then maybe we're in the mood for sex. Although men are always saying to me, "I've taken her to Bali and nothing happened." There's a wonderful video about this problem we have in turning off the chatter.
Wait. Oh, that is so good. Shit. He's getting bored. Okay, maybe this isn't gonna happen for me today. It's taking me too long. Oh God, where is he going now? Don't go down there. Oh God, I did not plan this. I did not get waxed this week. Oh man, I gotta work out. I know, my thighs are smushed together and I have cellulite. I'm gonna go running tomorrow. I'm gonna run 5 miles every single day until my thighs don't touch. I'm gonna be known as the girl who gets up at 5 a.m. faster than everybody else running on the beach every single day. Hello? Hello? Yeah, down here. Yeah. Yeah, could you just shut the hell up and let me enjoy myself?
I actually think that's really funny. It's just a video ad made by a company called Uprise World, which promotes, I think, a San Francisco company encouraging women to explore their sexuality or something like that. But it makes a really important point about the problem we have in being so distractible. What's really frustrating for men is that at the start of our relationships, many women are very different. I mean, women said to me, oh, we were bonking like rabbits. I couldn't get enough of him at the beginning of our relationship. And then it all changed. Now, there's a really interesting woman called Helen Fisher, who's an anthropologist in America. And she's done work on that early part of the relationship where we're first in love. That in love stage, where you're weak at the knees and you can't, keep away from each other. The psychologist called that the limerence stage. And she wired people up who were in love and finds there's actually a different brain chemistry associated with that period. And it tends to only last maybe 2 years max, and then that changes. And my feeling is that's part of this story, that for many women, they're really into sex when they're first in love, and maybe this different brain chemistry is part of that story, and you're with a new man and a new body, and it's all very different and exciting. But after a period that goes, and you revert to that problem of the damp wood, of the distractible libido, and that is the norm for most women. Now, of course, for men, that really sucks. I mean, you're with this woman who's all over you, and you think you found the perfect woman who's madly into you, and then after a couple of years, she turns off the tap. I suppose the point I'm making about this, I don't think that's a deliberate thing. I don't think she's deliberately pretended to be something she's not. But it very much is the common story that women are more likely to be really into sex at the start of a relationship, and after a couple of years, that tends to change. And that's the reason when I talk about this stuff, I've always got single women writing to the newspapers and saying, that's not true, we're all madly interested in sex, we all have high libidos. And I think there's a big difference between mating in the wild and mating in captivity. And the problem for women is mating in captivity, and we go off sex in long-term relationships. Not all of us, but a great many of us. And it's a total tragedy for men. Of course, one of the other things that happens is that often coincides with women having children a couple of years into the relationship, and of course we know what a distraction that is. Women are tired, they're distracted, their sensuality is turned towards their kids, and it's the period when most marriages, a lot of relationships run into trouble over differences in sexual desire. Now, men are so different. Men have up to 20 times the level of testosterone that women do, and it means an awful lot of men have an eternal flame, have an itch that never goes away. I've known men in their 80s who've said they want sex as much as they ever did. One of my diarists wrote to me and said that he could totally understand why Clinton wanted to have oral sex in the Oval Office. I mean, he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Why wouldn't he use sex to escape from all that tension? And I talked to him, and I talked to other women about this, and we of course think that's just crazy. If we were in the toughest job in the world, there's no way we'd be able to use sex to escape from all of that. When women are tense or they're anxious, sex is often the last thing they need. I mean, I just think it's fascinating how differently libido plays out for men and women, but of course it creates this enormous gulf between us, and it's very difficult for most of us to understand what it's like on the other side of the fence. One of the amazing people who volunteered for my research was a 71-year-old virgin. I mean, he hadn't planned to be a virgin at that stage of life. He'd been waiting for the perfect match, and she sadly never showed up. But he wrote to me and he said, I don't suppose I could really take part in this research. But he actually told me about his extraordinary life and the fact that he'd struggled all his life with a very strong libido. But he said, one of the things he said, which was really interesting to me, he said, compared to his married friends, he thought he wasn't badly off, because he'd watched couples go through tension over this sort of issue, and he said, at least there's no fights in my household. Well, what do we do about this gap in desire? I mean, the real point is, if both members of the couple are keen to resolve this problem, there's plenty they can do. I had this fabulous woman who talked to me about spending the first 10 years of her marriage dreading the hand creeping towards her in the middle of the night. And they fought about sex for year after year. She didn't want it nearly as often as he did, and he got really angry with her, and so it went on. And they had a very tough few years. They also lost a child and, went through a big crisis. Went along for, I think, a marriage encounter group, and ended up talking about all of this stuff, including the whole issue of sex in their relationship. And she decided there had to be a way of negotiating it. So what she decided to do was to pick a sort of frequency that would work for both of them. Every 3 days, they decided was the best thing. They were in their 30s, and they'd have it every 3 days. She got out her diary and wrote a big S in the diary. And when they were in their 40s, they dropped on to every 4th day. He was really happy because he said, even when I'm 70, I'll still get it once a week. But what was fascinating is they both wrote to me about how well that worked for them. So when there was an S in the diary, she'd make this big effort. She'd get her head in the right place. She'd make sure we had a relaxing day at work, and she'd go and have a pedicure and do things, that would get her in the mood, send him little sexy videos, send him little sexy messages about what they'd do when she got home. And she would anticipate pleasure and really look forward to it and would enjoy making love to him. And when there wasn't an S, he could come and give her a big cuddle, and she wouldn't withdraw thinking, oh my God, he wants it again. Now that's the sort of basic idea that if the couple is both interested in dealing with it, scheduling sex can really work for them. One day we're going to have our pink Viagra. We haven't got that yet. The drug companies around the world are looking for some sort of medication to help women with low desire. I mean, the whole issue of Viagra is a fascinating one, because they tried Viagra on women, and they find that, Viagra, of course, is all about blood flow in the genitals, and many women don't even notice when that happens. So all the emphasis now is on what's going on between our ears rather than between our legs. They realise they have to turn our heads on if they're going to increase desire in women. And so far we haven't done very well with that. We've got testosterone that works for some women, but essentially one day there's going to be a little pink pill. And there'll be some women who are lining up for it. I had women saying to me, what can you give me? I want to feel sexy again. And there are a lot of other women who simply aren't interested. And that's the fascinating thing. Even when this is talked about in the media, you get a lot of female commentators talking about the fact that this is some gigantic conspiracy between the drug companies and men, exploiting women and pretending they have a problem when they don't. And this whole idea of low libido is a manufactured problem that we don't need to worry about. It just drives me crazy. But the issue I talked about in the Sex Diaries, which really got me into a lot of trouble, was the idea of just do it. Now, I didn't make that up. That actually came from a sex therapist called Michelle Viner Davis in America. And she took this Nike slogan of just do it and said that one of the things women need to think about is whether they can experience sexual pleasure without desire. And she was drawing on some really important research from a woman called Rosemary Basson, who's a Canadian, who's worked for years with women who don't have any desire. Sex is just not on their agenda. And she finds that some of these women can, in fact, experience sexual pleasure without desire. I talk about the fact that if you put the canoe in the water and start paddling, and if you're with a man who knows how to make love to you properly, and if you can get your head in the right place and anticipate pleasure, then many women can experience pleasure and orgasm and so on without sexual desire. Desire kicks in once they get going. Now, when I talked about that, of course, all hell broke loose. I mean, it's a really unpopular thing to discuss the fact that women can experience pleasure without desire and to suggest that women just do it. I mean, the point is that it's something that lots of women don't want to hear. We've had generations of women now who've been told that if they don't want to have sex, they don't have to do it. It's just fine for them to shut up shop. And if they don't want it, that's fine. Sex is now somehow exempt from all the other areas in relationships where we're expected to compromise and negotiate. I don't like meatballs, but he loves meatballs, so I cook them for him, that's fine. Sex is somehow different from that. We're not allowed to negotiate. We're not allowed to compromise. We're not allowed to have one for the team or have mercy sex, have sex because you're just showing this man you love him or you want to please him or you don't want him to always feel sexually rejected. All of that has gone out the window. Of course, I'm not saying women don't have a right to say no to sex. I mean, I think for civilised relations between men and women, it's really critical that women shouldn't have to endure marital rape. But what I'm doing is simply suggesting that women should think about saying yes a little bit more often for their own sakes, for their own pleasure, as well as for the relationship. And that's the fascinating thing, that we don't ever talk about that. Women do crazy things to try to please their partners, to try to please their husbands. They'll cook 3-course meals, they'll spend hours searching for his favourite underpants at a shopping centre, when a 10-minute bonk every now and then would make that man a lot happier than a lot of the things that she'll do for him. And it's not as if we're asking women to do anything arduous or dangerous. It's not like cleaning an oven. A female doctor wrote to me the other day saying that she tells her patients it's not root canal therapy. I mean, if you're making love to a man and it's not working for you, I don't think it's a good idea to have intercourse. But you have hands, you have a mouth, you have a bottle of massage oil. It's not hard to give sexual pleasure, and it's not hard to show a man you care about his sexual needs. And there are women who totally understand this. I mean, when my book came out, I heard from lots of women who told me they were really shocked to hear other women talk about this whole issue. Women sneering about men's sexual desire, and women who felt absolutely entitled to give up on sex, to not have sex for years and years if they didn't feel like it. There are women out there who understand what it's like for men, women who are sexually generous in their relationships. The problem for men is how to find them. And there are also women who want a lot more sex than they're getting. I mentioned my juicy tomatoes, and that came from an author called Joan Sewell, who wrote a really good book called I'd Rather Eat Chocolate. Her book is really funny, actually. It's talking about searching for her lost libido and all the things she tries to regain her sexual desire. And she's once interviewed about the fact that she heard a woman describe herself as a juicy tomato. And Sewell says, I'm not a tomato, I'm more like a celery stick. And I mentioned that when I was recruiting people for my research, and they wrote to me, lots of people wrote to me and said, I'm a celery stick, I'm a juicy tomato. And I still run into women who come up to me and say, I'm a juicy tomato. So they're out there, and they were a really interesting group of women. 1 in 10 of my couples were couples where the woman wanted more sex than her partner. Some of those were women who had very strong libidos. They were just amazing. Women who wanted sex 3 times a day. And others were women who probably had pretty low, normal levels of desire, but were with men who weren't interested. I mean, there are men who have very low libidos all their lives. There are men who start off with high libidos and lose interest. There's a whole range of health problems that can cause lost libido in men, from things like depression or taking antidepressants, a whole range of health problems. But the other issue that comes up, particularly with the older men, that causes men to lose interest in sex is problems with erections. There are lots of older men who'd rather avoid having sex rather than risk having sex and failing. And that's a very real issue that older couples are dealing with. I had this fantastic couple writing for me who were in that situation. He actually had a heart condition and was on medication that was causing problems with his erections. And she wrote to me and said he was still determined to make love to her. She said, his affection and desire for me was truly beautiful and something I'll treasure always. It's hard to put into words what his gentleness, feather-like touches, kisses and cuddles did for me. It was a display of how deeply he loved and wanted to be with me and made me feel pretty special. And she talked about these sexy afternoons they had where she worried about the neighbours hearing her little squeals of delight. But what was fascinating about this woman is she was a woman who loved her husband's erection. And she said, I'm so sad when I look at what was once a magnificent pinnacle of manhood, which is now like a shriveled up weed that's been given a dose of Roundup. Now, for overseas people, Roundup is a form of pesticide that kills weeds. I don't know whether it exists in other countries. Now, the point about all of this is I've always said this just do it idea is a two-way street. It applies to men as well as women. And I think there should be an obligation on the low desire partner, whether that's a male or a female, to look and to consider his partner's sexual needs, his or her partner's sexual needs. And unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. I was once talking to a woman who runs a support group for partners of men who are going through prostate cancer treatments. And often in that situation, the men are dealing with, or obviously it's a big crisis for them, and many men withdraw from all intimacy because they're dealing with issues to do with erections. And she said, in that situation, she's always got women who are in tears in her group. Even women who thought they were totally over sex, who are shocked when their partners no longer come near them anymore. And that's a fascinating thing. I mean, you can have a woman in that situation who really misses that physical intimacy when she'd been knocking her partner back for years. I was once talking about all of this to an audience of men. It was actually a big Rotary group. And after the whole talk was over, a man came scurrying up to me. People tend to wait until everyone else has gone to talk about these things. And he explained to me he was dealing with prostate cancer and he was on hormone treatment, which of course tends to knock out the man's sexual desire. And he said he sat there listening to me and it just occurred to him that maybe it was possible that his wife was missing what had been a good sex life they'd had in the past. I mean, he wasn't interested because he had this hormone treatment, but he suddenly thought maybe we could still have that. Maybe I could still make love to her. And he had this big smile on his face and was desperate to go home and explore. I mean, maybe I was wrong. Maybe she wasn't in that category. But it's really important for men and women to think about their partners if they're dealing with low desire themselves. Now, the reaction to my research was really interesting. There was a whole bunch of blogs and articles coming out saying women would want more sex if men weren't such rubbish at it. And of course, I mean, that is an issue. Why would women want sex if the sex isn't any good? Originally, I hadn't thought I had to ask my participants in my research about what they did in bed, but I realised I actually had to ask this question of whether the sex was any good. And I talked to my women about this, for instance, and some of them were certainly with men who hadn't a clue. There were all sorts of jokes about men as lousy lovers. My favourite is, what's the difference between a G-spot and a golf ball? The answer, a man will spend 20 minutes looking for a golf ball. So there are stories out there about men who aren't interested, who never bother to learn how to make love to women properly. And I did find that there were some of my women were with men who didn't know what they were doing. I suppose my favourite was the woman who said her husband handled her nipples as if he was milking a cow. I think he was actually a farmer. So there were some pretty ghastly stories there. But as usual, that's only half the story. That's part of the story we always hear about, of course. But what we don't hear about is what it's like from the other side of the fence, what it's like for men. I had a chapter on this whole topic, which was called The Blind Man in the Dark Searching for a Black Cat That's Never There. And that's a man who spent 20 years looking for his wife's clitoris, and he never got it right. I love this idea of him peering in the dark looking for this. It sort of summed it up for me. As did, there was also another man who said to me, all I get from her are these little grunts and I can't tell whether it's an ouch or an ah. So there is this problem of communication from women. We can't expect men to make love to us properly unless we teach them about our bodies. And that's a real issue because a lot of women are very reluctant to do that. Of course, it's true that men don't necessarily get it right, that they give us far too much meat and potatoes and not enough hors d'oeuvres. There's never enough foreplay. And so it goes on. And we hear an awful lot about women's complaints about men as lovers. And what we don't hear about is what it's like on the other side of that fence. I've got a rather naughty cartoon for you, which is entitled Some Women Take Forever. I suppose the point about that cartoon is women aren't easy to please. Some of us have a lot of trouble with orgasms. Some of us change from day to day and want some sort of stimulation one day and something else the next. And how is a man to know unless we're really willing to tell him what's going on inside our heads? There's a British comedian who sums up the whole problem of trying to please women. It goes like this. He, labouring away, pauses to ask, "Are you nearly there?" "It's hard to say," says she. He plunges on. "If you imagine it as a journey from here to China, where would you be?" She considers. "The kitchen." So the other issue that comes up a lot when I talk about all this stuff is women would want more sex if men did more housework. There are endless media stories. Does doing the laundry get you laid? And it always implies if men only helped more around the house, then everything would be fine, that women would want more sex. And of course, there's some truth in that. I mean, resentment is a passion killer. If a woman is angry with a man because he does nothing to help her, there's no way she's going to want to go to bed with him. There's a broader problem here as well. When Karen Straughan was in Sydney recently, she talked to the Sydney Institute, which is a think tank, about why marriage is so risky for men. And one of the things she discussed is the fact that we're in a situation, a culture now, which totally supports women's demands, women's endless list of demands on men, while totally ignoring what men really want from their relationships. Karen also highlighted those fearful words that every married man dreads, "I'm not happy." And the really sad thing is more and more men are hearing those words from women. More and more married women aren't happy in their relationships. I think women's expectations of their relationships are totally excessive, far too high. And we women are really, really good at gnawing the bone and thinking endlessly about what's wrong with our relationships rather than focusing on the good things. And that's made marriage and relationships a very risky prospect for men. But that's going to be a topic for another time. But getting back to the housework issue, I had this woman writing for me. She's a married woman, she worked full time, she had a couple of kids, and she didn't write sex diaries, she wrote housework diaries. She wrote these endless diaries all about the fact that she had to work so hard and her husband never did enough to help her around the house, and when he did things, he got it all wrong. So he'd be doing the laundry and he'd get the laundry out of the dryer and he'd leave it all in a big heap on the floor instead of folding it all nicely when it was still warm. And she'd come home and the dog would have been there lying on the laundry and there were all these lumps of concrete covered in dog hair. And she said if he was to even think of asking for sex after that, she'd knock his block off. But the really fascinating thing is she wrote to me a little bit later and said they just had another conversation and he'd said to her, "Okay, I know you're always saying I don't do enough to help you, but even if we won the lottery and we had a housekeeper every day, I still don't think you'd want sex." And she said, "I deny and deny and deny, and deep down I know he's right." And of course, many women are in that situation. They won't admit it. And they use issues like housework to cover up what's actually going on. And when they go along and they drag their husbands in for counselling, and the men want to talk about the lack of sex in their relationships, the women and the female counsellors end up talking about housework because that's the issue they're comfortable discussing. One day I think I'm going to have to do another vlog on relationship counselling and why men should generally stay away from it. But there was another, getting back to the housework issue again, there was another woman, a fascinating woman, she described her husband as a domestic god. You know, she's talking about how he does everything to please her, he cooks the dinner, he's putting the kids to bed, and she knows he's looking for the green light. She knows he's desperately hoping he'll get some sex tonight. And she said to me, but he's not going to get it. I'm such a bitch. Yes, she's being a bitch, but she's surrounded by women cheering her on, by a culture that encourages her to respond only to her wants and needs and never to consider what it's like to be a husband, be a man living his life grovelling for sex. It's so easy for a man to be sucked in, to think he's found the perfect woman, the woman who's all over him and matches his libido at the start of their relationship. But the chances are that's going to change, and she will be dealing with that fragile libido, and what really matters then is her attitude. The big challenge for men is to find a sexually generous woman, a woman who understands how important sex is for most men and is willing to appreciate her man's lusty sexual drive. One of the things I've always loved about men is their relentless, exuberant sexual energy. It's such a bitch to live in this anti-male, female-dominated culture, which is working so hard to crush that energy and to make men feel ashamed of their joyous sexual natures. I'd love your support, I'd love your pledges. I'm going to put information about my Patreon page on the low bar, and maybe you can find some way of supporting me and spread the word about what I'm doing.